Welcome back. Here's where we left off. Every single part clean, painted, and ready for final assembly. Well, it won't put itself together, so grab a wrench and let's get started. Some of these products you're familiar with, some you may not be. Everyone has their own favorite, but based on recommendations from the Shop Dog and Outlaw Jack, I chose these. Your mileage may vary. The first thing to do was lift the block off the temporary dolly so I could get the gas tank installed. I used my engine lift and worked the heavy block around until I could safely set it down on its backside. Prepping the rejuvenated gas tank involved first installing the suction assembly. It is important that the vent outlet of the fitting face toward the governor side of the engine, while the supply outlet, the suction tube itself, faces the magneto side where the fuel pump is. It's also necessary to make 100% sure there is enough clearance in the bottom of the tank to clear the end of the assembly with its fuel filter. All threaded fittings were treated with gasolia. You should stir it up before using. Installing the tank wasn't difficult, but some of the connections are blind and must be done by feel. There are 4 connections to the tank: the breather overflow pipe and the supply pipe with a 90-degree compression elbow connect to the suction assembly. The drain pipe with cap and the fill return pipe connect directly to the tank fittings. This done, it's time to lift the block for the last time and mount it back on the skid. The next step is to install the cylinder or wet sleeve. To me, this was one of the most tedious steps as I'd never done it before. I just followed Shop Dog Sam's videos. I made a tool for pressing the sleeve in from the head end using the head bolts, just opposite of how I pulled it out in episode 2. I test fitted the O-ring just to be sure it would fit. Oops, someone dripped green paint in the hopper. Next, I applied a bead of Permatex Ultra Black RTV in the O-ring groove and stuff the ring in place. Also, note to self, using nitrile gloves is a great idea, but don't use black gloves with black RTV. I got it everywhere and it was not easy to clean off. I measured the distance from the head end of the sleeve to the O-ring groove and applied a bead of RTV to the point where the ring met the crown of the sleeve. Likewise, a sparing amount of RTV was applied along where the head end meets the block casting. Don't overdo this. The sleeve was fed into the block and eventually pressed into position by various arrangements of nuts, washers, and spacers on a 2x2 piece of square steel tube. I used the pulling tool I made to try and get the sleeve in as far as I could. It is about 5/1000ths of an inch proud. The gasket will absorb that, but if I had to do it again, I would have test fit the sleeve without the O-ring. Live and learn. I used a very thin coat of Permatex non-hardening gasket sealer on the governor side cover plate, and I won't do that again. Way too messy, and there is no mechanical reason to tightly seal it. If any grease leaks, I'll just wipe it off. Use assembly oil wherever you can. It is also somewhat sticky and helps hold hardware in place. The 5/8" bearing mounting bolts take a bit of fiddling to install. Don't goose the fasteners down until you're sure everything fits correctly. Installing the piston started with giving it a thorough oiling with Delo 400 15W40 oil. Outlaw Jack recommends this oil because it helps seat the piston rings. He said it would make a good choice for an all-around lubricant for old gas engines. I heavily oiled the cylinder as well. And put a grease rag under the connecting rod bearing before sliding the piston into the bore. A piston ring compressor is necessary, and pushing the piston in was easy. Before installing the crankshaft, be absolutely certain you locate and use a white marker to highlight the timing mark. According to the shop dog, this mark is always above the gear keyway. We will install the crank from the magneto side. Apply some pre-lube assembly oil to the bottom babbitt bearing on the governor side. My dear wife Laney was a big help, as this shaft is heavy and must be held up while installing the big magneto side cover plate with the big timing gear. It is a two-man job, or you have to mess with the engine lift. Unfortunately, my big butt got in the way of the video, so you missed the actual install. The only threaded stud on this engine is right here. Note the lack of paint on the bolt hole and the bottom of the 3/8" nut where it meets the cover plate. This provides the positive electrical contact for the ignition return. Now is the time to run a continuity check for the return path. I connected my digital multimeter between the bolt holes in the magneto base and the head bolts. Note almost zero resistance. I think the most difficult job so far was attaching the connecting rod bearing to the crankshaft. If we had one flywheel on the shaft, it would have been easier. Laney and I had to work together to get the position right, and her smaller hands made a big difference in tight places. Fortunately, Outlaw Jack had the shims in their proper location. The main bearing caps were next. I carefully arranged the shims according to whether they were on the governor side or the magneto side. Note the shims are different for each side. The thickest shim, in my case 70 thousandths, goes in first, followed by the thinner ones. Make sure you have the same number of shims on each side of the bearing. Giving the shims a light coating of assembly oil keeps them from sliding around. Tighten the bolts with lock washers, but don't over tighten. When the engine gets run in, you can retighten if necessary. It's time to get the governor side flywheel and the governor assembly installed. Back to the engine lift. This is the governor assembly that fits over the flywheel bushing that fits on the crankshaft. On a 6 horsepower engine, the governor actuating collar rotates, whereas on the smaller models, it is held in place with a pin. If everything is properly lined up, the flywheel with the governor in place will slide onto the shaft. I used plenty of Dello 400 oil. Note how the collar snaps back and forth. This controls the yoke that connects to the throttle back in the head. I'll explain more in later assembly steps. Lastly, I installed the main bearing cap on the magneto side in the same manner as I did on the governor side. Everything turned smoothly with no binds. A lot of work for 2 days, but no disasters. It's looking pretty good, and in the next part, we should finish the assembly process. There are a lot of parts to install on the magneto side. If you haven't watched the first 3 parts, please do so. In any case, thanks for watching. Your comments and suggestions. Part 5 will be here real soon.